Hello! Today I'm going to go ahead and talk about sectioning. Not psychological sectioning for crazy people. Similar, no, sectioning of your head before you start dreadlocks. Sectioning is generally done before backcombing or twist and ripping your hair into dreadlocks. Because whereas you can obviously just jump in and start backcombing or twist and ripping random lumps of dreadlocks, it's generally recommended that you want to section your hair first. Sectioning is when you take your head and sort of carve it up into squares, not literally, but you section off your hair into lots of squares, and therefore the hair within that square is then going to become the dreadlock. So all the hairs within that square will be backcombed or twist and ripped into the dreadlock that is going to form from that base. It can be done two ways. Either the whole head will be sectioned and then held together with elastic bands until the twist and rip or backcombing is done to that square, or it will be done one square at a time. It's obviously easier to get it even across the whole head if you put elastic bands across the whole head. You know, if you're going to do one square at a time, you might end up with running out of space when you get to one end and not being so even, but it depends where on the head you start. Always remember, if you're going to use elastic bands, that I always recommend to take the elastic bands out as soon as you have finished the dreadlocks. I've covered why elastic bands aren't particularly good for dreadlocks in a previous video, but you know, it's rubber, it's going to rub on the dreadlock root where it's soft, you don't want it to break hairs, and also loose hairs can mat over the top of the elastic bands and the elastic bands get stuck in the dreadlocks. So once you've finished the backcombing and twist and rip, I recommend taking all the elastic bands back out again. Okay, generally sections are going to be squares across your whole head, so if you saw a head that had been sectioned, it would look a bit like a chessboard. I've seen it done other ways, where the head is sectioned to look like a football or a soccer ball or triangles, but generally a square is the way to go, and the most common sizing for the square is a 1 inch by 1 inch. So before backcombing or twist and rip starts, you will normally have a head all sectioned off into 1 inch by 1 inch squares. The size of the sectioning is going to determine how thick the dreadlocks are going to be, because the larger the section, the more hairs that dreadlock is going to have access to. I'm not particularly sure how big my sections are, or whether I can find a single dreadlock, but this dreadlock here, it has a section somewhere around here, and obviously if it had a bigger section, this dreadlock would have, yes, it is a Congo, but okay, so the root here, if it had a bigger section, it would have access to more hair. It would be able to pull more hair in and therefore be thicker. So the larger the section, the more hair that dreadlock is going to have access to, and therefore the thicker the dreadlock is going to be. The confusion with sections that seems to be upsetting people on YouTube and on forums, I've seen a lot of people get upset by this, is that even though they've gone with 1 inch by 1 inch sections, they haven't come out with the dreadlocks that they thought they were going to get. So, you have two people sat next to each other, they both get 1 inch by 1 inch sections, they both get the dreadlocks done the same way, by twist and rip or backcomb, and then both sets of dreadlocks come out entirely different, completely different. Why is this? It's a problem for a lot of people, and as I said, it seems to upset people, but not everyone's hair is the same. You know, some people have thick hair, some people have thin hair. I have quite thick hair. So, if I have 1 inch by 1 inch sections, the dreadlocks that come out of that 1 inch by 1 inch section are going to be thicker than if someone else with thin hair had 1 inch by 1 inch sections. Why is that? Because within that 1 inch by 1 inch section, on my head, I have more hairs. I mean, equally there could be someone with thicker hair than me, and therefore their 1 inch by 1 inch section dreadlocks will be even thicker than that. Someone with really thin, fine hair will find that a 1 inch by 1 inch section maybe isn't thick enough, because it doesn't actually have enough hairs within that 1 inch by 1 inch section to create the dreadlocks that they want. You can see this when it's a common topic on dreadlock forums, where people compare how many dreadlocks they have. And the scope for this is huge. I mean, I've seen people with as few as 12 dreadlocks and as many as over 100. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, you'll have 12 really thick ones or 100 really tiny ones. And it's not always the case. The person with 12 dreadlocks obviously could have 12 huge dreadlocks, but they could just as easily have 12 medium dreadlocks across their scalp if they don't actually have very thick hair coming out of their head. And a guy with 100 dreadlock might have, you'd think he'd have 100 pencil thin dreadlocks, but again, not always the case. because if out of those 100 sections he has really thick hair, she has really thick hair, you could come out with 100 not actually that thin dreadlocks. So while sectioning is often the blame for when people don't get quite the right dreadlocks that they have been looking for, I've seen a lot of people be like, oh, I've only got X number of dreadlocks and they're quite sparse across my head. So often the sectioning is to blame when people don't come out with the dreadlocks that they thought they'd be going to be getting. You know, they have a picture of dreadlocks in their head and they aspire to that, but unfortunately the thickness of hair on their head is different to the thickness of the set that they're aspiring to, and therefore it's not going to work out how they want them to. It's common to find that people have gone in and expected to come out with a whole head of thick dreadlocks, but only ended up with, you know, a few sparsely populated across their head because they've had to have quite big sections for not that thick dreadlocks, just because their hair is quite thin. The sort of complaints and problems arise early, because when dreadlocks are new, either by backcombing or twist and rip, the root is quite tight. So with new dreadlocks you will often find that you can see the sectioning lines because the root is pulled really tight. This is obviously worse if you've kept the elastic band on, because it's going to be pulling the hair really tight, and even worse if you put wax or another product in there to sort of glues all the hair into that tight little root. But once you start washing the hair, the root will start to relax and you'll no longer be able to see the sectioning lines as obviously. So someone with weak old dreadlocks, you may in fact be able to really easily see all the sectioning lines in their head. You know, you'll be able to see the checkerboard on their head, even more so if they have particularly thin hair. But after they've had the dreadlocks for a few months and been washing them, the root will relax and sort of fatten up and start to fill out the section. There'll be some loose hairs and you really won't be able to see the checkerboard so much. By the time the dreadlocks are mature, it'll become even less obvious. I'm just going to touch on something that I watched today, where someone was confused by sectioning, and I will try and clear that up. Someone had gone in for dreadlocks and come out, and the dreadlocks didn't look how they wanted them to, and they blamed the sectioning. They thought that the sections were too big, and so you could see the lines in their head, and thought that they would have to start over because all these lines were visible. So as I said, as the dreadlocks get older and mature and you start to wash, those lines will become less visible. But what won't change is how many dreadlocks you've had. So this person wanted to go back, take the dreadlocks out, get smaller sections and therefore have more dreadlocks, but they wanted to have the same thickness dreadlocks, but more of them. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. You can go back and take smaller sections, but then you're going to get thinner dreadlocks within those sections. This person thought, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable to expect this, and I'll explain why they thought this. They thought that if they took the dreadlocks out, got smaller sections, but in fact backcombed the dreadlocks tighter so they would scrunch up more and be thicker, they thought that if you did that, although the dreadlocks would be shorter, because the hair is more scrunched up, that you would have the same thickness as before with the larger sections, but more of them. Unfortunately, it's not really the case. What will happen then is as the dreadlocks grow out from the smaller sections, the new growth will be thinner. It will be the size that you get from those smaller sections, and you'll just be left with the thicker lump of really tight backcombed hair on the end of it, so it'll be sort of like a club. It's really not a good idea to really tightly backcomb the hair anyway, because it will end up like a hard lump that will be a different texture to the new growth. But yeah, if you try and thicken them up by backcombing more, the new growth will not be that thick and you will be able to tell. I mean, it's easy to see why they thought this was the case. It's because their dreadlocks were almost the same length as the hair that they started with. So they expected the hair to shrink up more and fatten more, and they thought that was going to happen with the initial backcombing, which in some cases it does. So when you go in and have your hair backcombed, often the dreadlocks are shorter. Not in all cases will they be really tiny. In some cases they will be a fraction of the size of the original hair. Again, it depends on how thick the hair is. But this person's hair was not so much shorter than the original hair, so they thought, oh, well, it's because they haven't been backcombed up tight enough. If you've seen my shrinkage video, or you will know that what is actually the case here is that the hair will shrink up once you start to wash it. It's not to do with backcombing tighter or not. In most cases, it can be if someone has really gone to town with the back comb and made them too tight, and that's where you get the club. But most dreadlocks will really only start to shrink up once you've started to regularly wash them. After each wash, you will be able to see the difference. So I think that is all to go across on sectioning. Different sections on different people's hairs with different hair thicknesses are going to produce different dreadlocks. Little word of advice: if you're going to be sectioning your hair off, you should plan the sections, because that's where the dreadlock is going to grow from. And you know, if you have a really big section here, or at an awkward angle, if you back comb it too tight, you can pull on your temple and get headache. It's another reason not to overly tighten the root, because you know, you'll get the squares visible, it'll pull, it'll hurt. So plan out where you want your sections to be, and then relax a little. If you relax, let the root relax, sort itself out. If you have any questions regarding sectioning or the dreadlock things, you can leave a comment here or video response, or there's a link down here for a Lazy Dreads blog where different things are written up. And thank you.